Fred sometimes liked to go to a bar to have a drink before he went home after work. There were some tables and chairs in the bar, but it was too early for most people when Fred was there, so he seldom found anyone to talk to. Then one evening he went into the bar and saw a man playing draughts at the table, but he could not see anyone in the chair opposite him. He went nearer to look and was very surprised to see that the man was playing against a dog. When it had to move one of its draughts, it stood on its back legs on the chair. Fred watched while the two played their game, and when the dog lost, Fred went up to its owner and said, "I've never seen such a clever dog before." "Well," answered the other man, "it isn't really very clever. I always win." A very strict officer was talking to some new soldiers whom he had to train. He had never seen them before, so he began. "My name is Stone, and I'm even harder than a stone, so do what I tell you or there'll be trouble. Don't try any tricks with me, and then we'll get on well together." Then he went to each soldier one after the other and asked him his name. "Speak loudly so that everyone can hear you clearly," he said, "and don't forget to call me sir." Each soldier told him his name until he came to the last one. This man remained silent, and so Captain Stone shouted at him, "When I ask you a question, answer it. I ask you again, what's your name, soldier?" The soldier was very unhappy, but at last he replied, "My name's Stonebreaker, sir," he said nervously. Mr. Edwards and Mr. Wilson were friends. They were sitting in a train when another man came in. There was going to be an election soon, and Mr. Edwards and Mr. Wilson began talking about politics. Mr. Edwards supported the Labour Party strongly. Suddenly, the third man began to argue with Mr. Edwards. He supported the Conservation. They argued for a long time, and then Mr. Edwards said, "Well, I can make you change your mind, and you can make me change mine, so let's have an agreement. I won't vote for the Labour Party, and you won't vote for the Conservative Party. Then we'll be able to stay at home comfortably, and nobody will lose anything." The other man agreed. They all got out at the same station, and Mr. Edwards drove Mr. Wilson home in his car. "That's the fifth person I've made that agreement with," he said to him. Mary was a university student. She did not have very much money, and her parents were not rich, but she had an uncle who had been fortunate enough to collect great wealth. He had no children, and Mary was his favorite niece, so he always gave her valuable Christmas and birthday presents. When her Uncle George's birthday came around, Mary wanted to buy him something really special. But because he was so wealthy, she did not know what to get him. She went into the best shop in her town and explained what her problem was to one of the helpful young shop assistants. Finally, Mary said to her, "I suppose this isn't the first time anybody has come to you with this problem. What do you have for someone who's already got everything he wants or needs?" The girl sighed deeply and answered, "Envy, only envy." When Dick was 6 years old, he went and stayed with his grandparents in the country for a few weeks in the summer. He talked a lot with his grandmother while he was there, and she told him a lot of interesting things about their family, which he had not known before. When he came home again to his own parents, he said to his father, "It is true that I was born in London, Daddy." "Yes, it is, Dick," his father answered. "And were you really born in Germany?" Dick asked. "Yes, that's right," his father answered. "I was. And it is true that Mommy was born in Ireland," Dick continued. His father said, "Yes, it is. But why are you asking me all these questions?" Dick answered, "Because when Granny told me all those things while I was with her, I couldn't understand how we had all met." Mr. Richards worked in a shop which sold, cleaned, and repaired hearing aids. One day, an old gentleman entered and put one down in front of him without saying a word. "What's the matter with it?" Mr. Richards said. The man did not answer. Of course, Mr. Richards thought that the man must be deaf and that his hearing aids must be faulty. So he said again more loudly, "What's wrong with your hearing aids, sir?" Again the man said nothing. So Mr. Richards shouted his question again as loudly as he could. The man then took a pen and a piece of paper and wrote, "It isn't necessary to shout when you're speaking to me. My ears are as good as yours. This hearing aid is my wife's, not mine. I've just had a through operation, and my problem is not that I can't hear, but that I can't speak." Miss Jones teaches mathematics at the school. In one of her classes, the boys and girls are about 8 years old, and they are not very good at arithmetics. Miss Jones always tries to make the work interesting and amusing as well as useful. One day she gave them a question. "If you go to the market to buy vegetables," she said, "and a carrot and a half costs 12 pence, how much will you have to pay for a dozen carrots?" The pupils began to write in their exercise books, and for a long time nobody spoke. Then one boy put his hand up and said, "Could you repeat the question, please, miss?" The teacher began, "If a carrot and a half," but the boy interrupted her. "Oh, a carrot and a half?" he said. "All this time I've been trying to work it out in cabbage, miss." Mr. Richards worked in a small seaside town, and he and his wife had a comfortable house near the sea. During the winter, they were quite happy there, but every summer a lot of their relatives used to want to come and stay with them because it was a nice place for a holiday, and it was much cheaper than staying in a hotel. Finally, one June, Mr. Richards complained to an intelligent friend of his who lived in the same place. "One of my wife's cousins intends to bring her husband and children and spend 10 days with us next month again. How do you prevent all your relatives coming to live with you in the summer?" "Oh," the friend answered, "that isn't difficult. I just borrow money from all the rich ones and lend it to all the poor ones. After that, none of them come again." Mrs. Gray was old and deaf, and she was in court accusing a neighbor of following his dogs to come into her garden, damage her vegetables, and run after her cat and her kitchens. After hearing both sides, the judge thought it would be best and cheapest for everybody if Mrs. Gray and her neighbor could come to some sort of agreement to settle the matter between themselves. So he asked the lawyer who was representing Mrs. Gray to find out how much money she wanted from her neighbor in order to stop the action against him. The lawyer explained to her what was happening, but Mrs. Gray could not hear what he said, so he repeated loudly, "The judge wants to know what you will take." "Oh, thank you very much," Mrs. Gray answered politely. "Please tell him that I'll have a glass of beer." George was a newspaper reporter who worked for a small local newspaper in a country town. Nothing much ever happened there. One day, George's boss sent for him. "George," he said, "James Bright is making a speech at the town hall tonight. I want you to go and report on it for us." "James Bright?" George said. "He is a terrible old fool. He never says anything worth reporting. Bright is our best-known local politician," said the boss. "We'll have to print a reporter on that speech." So George went to the meeting, and Bright spoke for 2 hours without stopping. When George got back to the office at last, the boss was waiting for him. "Well, George," he said, "what did the old man say?" "Absolutely nothing," said George. The boss wasn't surprised. "All right, George," he said, "you'd better not write more than 2.5 columns on it." Some people were queuing outside the Scala Theater for tickets for a very popular show. They had to wait for several hours, and during that time they were entertained by a young man who was playing very nicely on a trumpet. The queue enjoyed his music and put quite a lot of money in the box that he had on the ground in front of him. At last, one of the people in the queue said to him, "You play too well to be a beggar." "I'm not a beggar," the young man said. "I'm studying to be a trumpet player in a big band, and I have to practice several hours every day. So I thought it would be nice to do it in the fresh air instead of in my small room on days when the weather was nice, and also to get a bit of money at the same time."